And you're warned and it's on, but I don't think your picture is being seen. So you think about what we were talking about. Virtual representation was something that was sort of accepted, but it was not something that the colonists really liked. They were not into that. So, if you look at the date here, think about that. The right to a jury trial, the right to having evidence. You guys know probable cause, like under search and seizure laws, under our Bill of Rights, you have to have what's called probable cause, right? Well, a writ of assistance was like without potentially probable cause. This is kind of like, we have a law in America that I'm not a big fan of, but it is what it is, so to speak. I hate that phrase. I don't know why I say it. But it's called stop and frisk, and it means that, like, if a policeman is suspicious of someone's activity, he can or she can stop that person and kind of like feel them up and see if they've got any drugs or guns or anything on them. I'm not a big fan of that. I think that leads to things like racial profiling and others. Well, let's be clear. Americans, merchants were smuggling. there were smugglers. You understand? And that would have been a common sort of way to get out of the Molasses Act and other laws that were saying you have to go to British ports. You have to go through a British customs officer, an agent. So what happened is these sort of search warrants were violating traditional rights. But when Otis loses his case, Otis being a merchant here, it says, and this is interesting. So when we talk about English common law, that's how most of the way, besides the Bill of Rights, that the English people feel their rights kind of are through court cases. Yeah. Well, now you have a case that says, well, English common law doesn't override parliamentary law, parliament statute. So in other words, Parliament basically gave the authority to suspend traditional rights that English people had. So that's the beginning. But keep in mind the date, y'all, is right here in the French and Indian War. Okay. Now, I could ask you this directly, but you probably don't know this story. So I want to talk about the first half and see if you guys can pick up on the second half, because it's pretty wild. Hey, can y'all see this okay? I'm using a different way to look at it right now. Is this viewing okay? You're nodding your head. All right. So when you think about the French and Indian War, warfare is the most expensive thing a country can do. Okay. So over the course of the war, keep in mind, Pitt had told the colonists, you don't have to pay for the war, right? So the British national debt had ballooned, had swollen up so big. Now, people in our country today don't seem to understand what the problem is with the national debt. So I'm going to talk about the national debt here for a minute, because why not? I love to talk about the national debt. It's like my hobby horse, my boogie, whatever, man. So we're going to take a look at this tab here. All right. So this is the U.S. national debt, right? And the problem with a debt is not that having a debt itself is inherently bad. I mean, you have to borrow money to buy a house or buy a car or just about anything, start a small business. But when the debt becomes so big, it will eat away at your ability to pay for other services, including national defense, which for the British was a big issue. Like they got to defend their empire. So if you look at this, the amount of interest that we spend on the national debt, okay, the amount of interest. So you keep that in mind annually. So that's the millions place. So we spend every year $340 billion in interest payments. So if you think about what the government has to provide as a resource, it can be border security or college assistance, or research for space exploration or whatever. $340 billion is a lot of money. Unfortunately, as the debt increases, lenders start to become concerned that the American government is not going to pay back the interest. Therefore, they begin to raise interest rates in order to get their interest back quicker. You understand? To get more money, quicker return. And if they raise the interest rates, that means the amount of the interest payment balloons even further. Now, we've been very fortunate in America that our interest rates are extremely low. All right. Now, the good news is, y'all, our government sets interest rates. All right. But at some point, investors may say, I don't really trust the government's ability to pay back its debt, or willingness, not necessarily ability, but willingness. And therefore, they began to go somewhere else to borrow, to loan money. So they stopped loaning money to the federal government, which means the government has to be willing to pay more to get people to lend them money. Well, if that interest continues to grow, and it is growing, look at that in real time, all right, with the total debt, then what this will lead to is you're having to pay more in taxes, okay, which is something you don't want to do. Nobody wants to pay more in taxes, particularly for something that you didn't get the benefit for, right? So keep in mind, the American colonists said, we don't need you, England, for the French and Indian War, right? They did it anyway. And then now this huge debt is looming. And so they're like, well, we want the colonists to help pay for it, okay? Keep in mind also that the other major issue for the British had to do with trade, right? Trade is, the amount of money that went into the country versus the amount of money that went out of the country. And so if you follow the U.S. trade relationship, you'll see that there's a bit of concern here as well. If you come down here to trade deficit, you can see this or not, but you'll see that it's $830 billion a year, or currently. Now, the good news is it's shrinking, all right? Probably you can take a wild guess why it's currently shrinking is the global pandemic, meaning we're buying more local stuff because we can't get foreign stuff as quickly. But that's the amount of money more that leaves our country this year, currently this year, than has come into our country. And that's absolutely not what the British wanted. They didn't want a trade deficit where money was leaving England. And so they made a lot of rules to prevent money from leaving England. Okay, so let's go back to our PowerPoint and dig on that for a minute. Okay, so it's the second point I'm looking at here that's really fascinating to me. So it kind of makes sense that the British government needed to keep troops in the colonies. Can anybody remember why they felt the need to do this? The primary need. Why would the colonial location need troops? Nobody knows.
Defense against the Indians.
Yes, very good. As a defense against the Indians. Excellent. So if you remember, Pontiac's rebellion occurred in 1763, right? Right at the end of the French and Indian War, right after it ended. So that was Paxton Boys being angry. Now, Pontiac was very successful in his attack, so much so that you had this thing called the Proclamation of 1763, right? So if you were answering on a unit test, why did the British say they needed to keep all these troops here? And you answered the defense of the colonies, you wouldn't be wrong. You wouldn't be wrong. Then there's and I put this down here as an interesting sort of reality check, the kind of stuff that's under the radar. In reality, the British had such a big military with so many officers, they had to keep them paid, right? So they wanted to keep the army there so that 1,500 officers, British colonels and generals and majors, would have a job, would stay in keep working. And they were well connected to Parliament. So in England, the British people did not want a standing army. In other words, they didn't want an army hanging around with thousands of people. So they decided, well, let's just leave them in America. And that way you don't have to disband the army. Keep in mind, at the time in history that this occurs, typically once your military was done fighting, they kind of disbanded and went home, But the Brits, go ahead.
Wasn't that done through the Quartering Act?
Yes, that's exactly right. Very good. Foreshadowing of the Quartering Act. Exactly. So the Brits said, we don't want you here in Britain. And the Parliament was like, we'll just keep them housed in Massachusetts, for example. And look at what John Adams, who was a very smart lawyer, said. Revenue is money, like taxes, is still demanded from America and spent to the swarms of officers, and pensioners in idleness and luxury. So he's saying we're being taxed to pay for these soldiers, officers, to be rich. And that's the kind of stuff that is often left out of the narrative. You don't read that in the book. But of course, on the surface, yes, it's here for your protection and they're here for your good. But what was known by the intelligentsia, the smart American colonists, was that, oh, no, we're being taxed to finance these guys, to pay for their nice big fat houses and parties and their wives' dresses and, all that fun stuff. So this is sort of like how politics works. It's like below the obvious reason you have this personal gain going on here, this graft, this corruption, which is very common when you mix government and money with other people. Okay, so moving on, you have a guy come in he has the role of, at this time, prime minister, and he is stuck with a real problem of revenue. Okay, so his name's George Grenville. I'm not going to give you any kind of biography of him. But he's going to have Parliament pass 3 major laws, okay, in succession. So the Sugar Act is noteworthy. And why is the Sugar Act noteworthy? Like, in other words, what is the key part of the Sugar Act? Anybody read this far yet?
It was the first law that got passed to raise tax revenue.
All right, for revenue. Now, that's different from, I'll fix that in a minute, tariffs. So if you think about what tariffs were, y'all, what were tariffs designed for?
Support the mercantilism system.
All right, very good. To regulate mercantilism, to decide, we would call them today protective tariffs, so that you would buy British goods from the British East India Company and not goods from the Dutch West India Company or something like that. So taxes on other people's stuff. Okay, well, that made sense. That's trade policy. But this is revenue. Now, what is revenue versus, non-revenue?
Revenue is essentially for the country.
Okay. Which, for the home country?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, good. So if you think about that, let me give you an example. I'm not going to do the debt clock again, but let me just explain to you about, in America, are you guys familiar with income tax? Probably heard of that? Yeah, sure. So the income tax is not what the Sugar Act was, but the income tax is a tax that you pay that goes to the general budget of the United States Congress. So the Congress can then take that money, the income tax money, and spend it on anything. You can spend it on federal highways. It can spend it on the Defense Department. It can spend it on the Justice Department, whatever. It's generally designed for that purpose, any kind of money. So we call that a revenue tax, a tax on getting money for the government to operate. And then, of course, you have something called the payroll tax. And don't forget to mute yourself when you're not talking, okay? And so the payroll tax is designed solely to fund Social Security and Medicare. So you can't use that tax for something else, right? So the typical Englishman in America was like, well, you can tax me for trade policy because then I can avoid that tax by buying British stuff, right? But this tax was saying, if you buy this other type of sugar or molasses, that money isn't going to be used to regulate trade. It's going to be used to pay for those generals and pay for those soldiers and pay for the debt for the war. And that's different because that's not what the colonists in their minds had agreed to. Now, another law, which is really infamous at the time, is called the Currency Act. And if you're not familiar with the Currency Act, it made it a crime. It made it illegal for the colonists to make their own money.
Didn't that actually happen and that was a royal veto occurred?
Yes. And so the royal veto is when the monarch says, we're not letting that local bill get passed. Because what happened was, as you read, I hope, there was a currency shortage in America. Because of this trade relationship, British gold was not coming to America. So they didn't have any money. Here in our county, the major source of trade was tobacco. Like we would trade tobacco receipts. Like here's 100 pounds of tobacco, or here's an IOU for 5, and that's what we traded. Now, not actual leaves, but like pieces of paper with tobacco value on it, because we didn't have any money. So they would make sort of local money and then try to pay British goods, pay for it. And the government was like, no, you can't do that. And so you could not make your own money. So there was a money shortage, right? And then what money you did get was now going to be taxed further. And then there's really this next one, there are two quartering acts. So the first quartering act, which is this one, wasn't going to put dudes in your house. Okay. The first quartering act said it would use tax money to build, housing for troops. So like you would have to garrison troops in your own community, your village, your town. Now later, they're going to take it a step further under the Intolerable Acts and make them actually be able to stay in your house. And so I want you to imagine if you're a 16-year-old young lady and there's a 23-year-old naval sailor in your house or a 21-year-old Marine, imagine how your parents are going to react. They're not going to like that too much, are they? Plus the sheer premise of having soldiers living in your house without your permission. But none of these acts draw an enormous opposition. I mean, they're not popular, but they're kind of, within the British government's ability until this last one. And the Stamp Act is by far, and I do mean by far, the most infamous of these first series of laws. And so we really want to focus on the Stamp Act, okay? Now, here you have the beginning of opposition, and we're going to get down here to the Stamp Act in just a second, okay? It's called Stamp Act crisis, see that? But you have the beginning of notable opposition to British policy, okay? Now, up until this point, the French and Indian War was paramount, but it's a year later, and you have a figure emerge in Boston. You probably heard of him, Sam Adams. And Sam Adams is like the guy initially. He is by far the sort of spark of this movement. He was a educated man. He was a brewer by profession. He made beer. He hung out in taverns, which was perfect. But he says, if our trade may be taxed, why not our land? Keep in mind, the British aren't officially taxing land yet. Why not the produce of our lands? And this we apprehend annihilates our right under our charter, Massachusetts charter, to govern and tax ourselves. It strikes our privileges as who? We're British. Yeah, we're British, and we hold in common with the people who live in Britain, right? If taxes are laid upon us in any shape without our representation, we are reduced to the state of slaves. Now, Sam Adams not a slave owner himself, but I do want to talk about this. These folks had a genuine sense of what freedom looked like because every one of them knew what slavery looked like. So you will frequently see the treatment. Now, it might be hyperbolic, exaggerated, but you will frequently read the founding fathers comparing the sort of treatment that they're having as Englishmen by the British Crown to slavery. Now, I would argue that's quite exaggerated, but these people knew the opposite of freedom because they were witnesses of it. They saw slavery firsthand, in port cities and, of course, throughout the South. And so whenever they're analogizing loss of freedom, they call it slavery. And we will be like the state of tributary slaves. So Sam Adams, first to really start protesting, and this is Sugar Act protest, Sugar Act, if our trade may be taxed, because it's being taxed for revenue. Don't forget that part. All right. And then down here in Virginia, the other guy who's at the start. So we have two guys who are really the sort of vanguard of the revolutionary mindset. And in Massachusetts, it's Sam Adams, and in Virginia, it's a fella named Patrick Henry, who you've all heard of, but you may not know that much about. All right. And Patrick Henry was a landowner, wealthy, slave owner, planter. All right. And he's writing about a response for the Virginia House of Burgesses. He believes that the Virginia House of Burgesses should speak against the Stamp Act. Now, this is going to be blocked by the Virginia governor, but it's still a publication. It still gets circulated. All right. But in it, he says they brought with them their immunities that are possessed by Britain. So initially the claim, and this is something I'm trying to get at really hard. Initially, the claim by the revolutionaries is not revolutionary. They're saying we're British being treated not like British people. So both Sam Adams and Patrick Henry are both evoking their rights as Englishmen, not human rights, not natural rights, but English rights, and that's really a common refrain here. And it says that the colonists are entitled to liberties, privileges, immunities of subjects of England. The taxation of the people chosen by themselves, all right, is completely legit, right? That's the fair way to do it. That's a security against burdensome taxation. Later on in history, you're going to have one of the greatest Supreme Court justices of all time, Justice Marshall, Chief Justice Marshall, will say the power to tax is the power to destroy. In other words, if you want to get rid of something, you just put huge taxes on it. I've said for years to my conservative friends who are really, really opposed to abortion, I'm like, well, guys, the Supreme Court has ruled that you have a right to privacy. I have a right to privacy. But one of the things the Supreme Court has also ruled is that taxation is completely legal. So if you don't want abortions to be legal, you just tax them out of existence. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that myself, but I'm saying that's within the realm of the power of the government. They may tax you if they don't want you to do something, all right?
Aren't they technically taxed though through health insurance? Or
no, you're misunderstanding how I'm talking about taxing the procedure, the doctors, and again, I'm not
taxing the whole
right. So like if I don't want you to smoke cigarettes, I tax cigarettes a lot, and we do. We have what's called a sin tax, SIN tax in America for lots of items that we think is bad for your health. Alcohol is taxed at a higher rate. So depending on what the government wants to do, it is within its legal authority to tax you. That is something the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and England had as an authority. But they're saying you don't have the power to tax us without our consent. Now, the question becomes is whose consent? So what they're saying is not individual consent, not like one person at a time's consent, but rather the consent of the local represented bodies. Okay. So in Patrick Henry's case, he's talking about the Virginia House of Burgesses. His Majesty's people of this most loyal colony, without interruption, enjoy the right of being governed, respecting their policy, internal policy, and that has not been forfeited. We didn't give that up. Therefore, the General Assembly has the right, only right, catch that, to tax the colony. Okay, so Patrick Henry is not saying, "Hey, let's break away from England," is he? There's nothing in here like "give me liberty" or "give me death." This is not Sam Adams saying, "Let's form the Sons of Liberty to destroy the British government in America." They're saying, "Hey, you guys have forgotten what you're supposed to do. This is your responsibility to let us do this." Now, the question becomes, does Parliament agree with them? And the answer, of course, initially is no. But it's not enough to simply write really cool letters. You have to do some other stuff if you want to really push back. So that might be, if you look today, you could see protests of things in our society. Marches are very common, not very common, but they happen. I remember, when you had an NFL athlete began, taking a knee, Colin Kaepernick, that's an action, whether or not you agree with it or not, it's clearly an action. So we have protests in our society. In free society, we have protests. And so in England, there was a right to assemble. You could gather together as people. And so you had a small group formed in Boston, in one of those taverns. Remember I told you taverns were like the places people hung out, right? So they hung out in Boston and they met in a meeting house. And this is what is called the Liberty Tree. It's still there. The Liberty Tree, it's in Boston. It's an old tree. And they formed a group called the Loyal Nine, evolved into a group called the Sons of Liberty. So, if you want to talk about America's first patriots, the first New England Patriot team, so to speak, it was the Sons of Liberty. And they were sons. Now, later on, and not much later, I'm going to show you, there is a group called the Daughters of Liberty. So don't think the ladies are immune or ignorant of what's going on. But initially, these are a group of protesters. And what they do is they start working with the community, so to speak, in New England and say, we will not buy British stuff. Now, this is not an overt boycott. A boycott says we will not sell or buy anything with each other, but it is an agreement to boycott one side. So keep in mind, one of the functions under mercantilism, what's the function of a colony under mercantilism? Like, what's one of its reasons for existing?
To buy goods from the
Yes, to buy finished products from the mother country. Well, now, and there are lots of colonial Americans, and they have been buying lots of British stuff. And so if this idea takes off, then it is going to have serious repercussions in England on businessmen. And guys, I got to tell you, if you want to know how the civil rights movement ultimately won, it wasn't simply marching. It was things like the Montgomery bus boycott, when the entire bus system of Montgomery was going to fail because the people who were its customers stopped using it. So if you really, I listen to groups like Black Lives Matters today, and I hear them protest, and and that's every person group has a right to free speech and assembly. But if they really want to pressure people particularly people of note, they pressure them economically. And this is one of the reasons why I think groups like the NFL and the NBA have been more supportive, because they realize, well, some of our major consumers are African Americans. So if you want to pressure someone without rioting, because keep in mind, Gandhi said once, and again, I'm not insinuating Black Lives Matters are rioters, but if you think about Gandhi, civil disobedience protester, he said, as soon as we become violent, we being the Indian people, then we will be the vandal, we will be the criminal. But if they're the violent ones, then the world will see them as the bad guys, right? So for these these American sort of resistors, initially all they wanted to do was say, we're not going to buy your stuff, to try to pressure the businesses that would influence Parliament. Well, that worked. It worked really, really well. Okay. Now, that worked way better than this other thing. Now, I'm going to mention this other thing because it's the first formal meeting. Everybody hear this? The first formal meeting of the colonies post-French and Indian War. So, in other words, the colonies are not really that unified. You had this Albany Congress thing that the British government called, didn't really work. You've had things like the Great Awakening, which were shared cultural experience. But by and large, the colonial bodies didn't interact that much with each other. They were distant from one another. They didn't talk that much to each other. And so they said, we need to get together. We need to meet. And so they did. And so you copy this down about the Stamp Act Congress. I want to show you something that's interesting. I'll be right back. I'm not running. So I work at Monticello, so I don't know if you guys know where Monticello is. It's the home of Thomas Jefferson. It was his home. And the last time I worked at Thomas Jefferson, can you guys see this book? If I hold it up, can you see that? Is that visible? So the last time I was there working, they gave you a free book, among other things, so free swag. And in it is and this is the book given out at Monticello. It's kind of like the best little essential little bio of TJ here, Thomas Jefferson. The definitive historian on the Revolutionary says it's the best short biography ever written. On the back, it's got a bunch of people praising it. So I'm reading it one day. Now you look at my Stamp Act Congress notes, right? October 65, 9 out of 13 colonies, where they create a document that says, King George, we're unhappy. You're taking away our rights. And you'll see down here, Virginia was not represented by the General Assembly, had been stopped by Lieutenant Governor Fauquier. You guys know Fauquier County, named after him. So Fauquier wouldn't let the Virginians go to this meeting, okay? Wouldn't let them gather there. And so what happened is, I'm reading this book, which is really a good book. And this shows you how funny life works. And I'm like, in October 1765, responding to the need to coordinate American resistance, delegates from all the American colonies except Georgia met in New York City. New York City, okay? They say that. The first intercolonial gathering to oppose British policies, the Stamp Act Congress adopted a set of defiant resolutions and endorsed a boycott of British goods. So the boycott we're calling non-importation agreements. But did anybody catch the other maybe potential issue with that? Now, this shows you the depth of detail that an AP teacher ends up getting into, but how many colonies did this author say were there?
12.
12, except Georgia, right? So guess what? Got it wrong. He missed it, all right? And it was a comment. I mean, it's an easy error. He's talking about a later event, the Continental Congress, which, we're going to see. But nonetheless, I was reading and I was like, wait a minute, that ain't right. Virginia, I knew Virginia didn't go. And so I emailed the professor in New York at NYU, and he said, oh, you're right. And so he complimented my class and the teacher, and the new book doesn't have that. It's edited. So my point about this is that history is a process where the facts are out there, but sometimes errors get made. Just errors like in some proofreader missed that in the proofreading. So, but notice the number. It was not all of them, but what? but one. It was 9, but 9's good. 9's progress. 9 out of 13. Okay. Because that means that the colonies are starting to work together. That being said, though, the king completely ignores this. So why is the Stamp Act repealed? Oh, let's read the resolutions. It is inseparably essential to the freedom of people and the rights of Englishmen that no taxes shall be given without their consent or without their representatives. The duties of these colonies is to procure the repeal of the act. So we're just writing for you to take the act back. Just cancel the act. Well, they didn't pay any attention to this in Britain, but they paid a whole lot of attention to what? So the Congress didn't do much, but what did they pay attention to?
The colonies together.
Well, that they didn't know that much about that. If I'm a hat maker in London, why do I care?
Because people weren't buying the hats anymore.
That's exactly right. They're not buying the hats made in London. And so the hat maker in London wrote his member of parliament, right? And he said, you better get rid of this law. They're not buying my stuff. You dig? So if you want to put pressure on the government, you need to pressure the people who actually can pressure the government. So this is why I've told my friends who are supporters and involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, pressuring the NFL is far more effective than pressuring the city of Oregon. You understand the difference? So you have immediate response, but then when you get the publicity of the music industry, for example, or the publicity of the entertainment and athletics industry, pressuring the government and boycotting states. Now, you guys may recall, if when I was growing up, they were creating Martin Luther King Day as a holiday. Arizona was not going to make it a national holiday. It was not going to vote in favor of it. And so the NFL did not hold the Super Bowl in Phoenix, which is where they had intended to hold it. So do you think Arizona maybe changed its mind after that?
Yep.
Pocketbook issues, folks. This is how you motivate people who are involved in the government. And so when they boycotted or non-imported British products to the American colonies, that hurt British business people. And British business people did not like getting hurt. And they said, Parliament, get rid of this law. It is not good for me. And that worked. It totally worked. And so with that, they repealed the Stamp Act. They just got rid of it. They're like, well, that was stupid. Now, I do think this is kind of interesting. There were riots. Keep in mind, riots are very common. I know you guys are like, oh, rioting is awful. And it is awful. Don't get me wrong. Destruction of property is one of the worst things that a free society should have. But most people don't sit down and write textbooks or treatises or theses on how to reform society. It's really hard to organize mass boycotts and stuff, but it ain't hard at all to attack the British tax collector's house. You understand? And they do a whole lot of that during this period. So the British tax collectors are going to have bodyguards, and that's what the generals say. Hey, we'll help. We'll put troops right beside your house. Okay. And so this is the picture that really is cool to me. Can you guys see what this is? Years ago, I graded an AP exam that had this document on it. The DDQ.
It's a teapot with the words "No Stamp Act" on it.
Right. Right. So it's a teapot. And so some of my students thought, the students who responded to the AP exam thought that meant like something to do with like the Boston Tea Party or, the tea tax. But that's not what that is. It says clearly on it what it is. So here's where my big question is for you to see. This is like the AP zinger here. What's interesting about the teapot? Oh, you don't see it? You don't get it? It's okay. It's hard. It's not easy.
I think I partially.
It's not in the picture. It is it's the picture itself. What is interesting about this artifact?
Could it be like some sort of propaganda?
It's totally propaganda. Very good. Yeah. Like, can you imagine coming out at dinner at tea time and pouring it? It's like no Stamp Act right there emblazoned on it. I think if I want to be a successful movement today, if I'm, think about one of the things that's like the Blue Line police officer, they've logoed it. They've turned it into an iconic logo. Or the Black Lives Matters. If you can make it into paraphernalia, clothing, and that's you commercialize it. But who is manufacturing that teapot? Oh, British people, right? A person in Britain, because they don't make teapots in America. That's ceramics. That's that kind of high quality professionalism, and it's got a nice glaze on it. That's made in England. So somebody in England had the idea of manufacturing a no Stamp Act teapot to sell to Americans. which is pretty funny when you think about it. But to me, that's kind of the point, is that in England itself, there was some awareness of what was going on. And they're like, yeah, get rid of this Stamp Act. It's hurting our businesses. Let me sell you a no Stamp Act teapot to encourage your business. You understand? So again, when I think about the NBA and the NFL, those guys know where the money is coming from. They know who their customers are, their consumers. They're not going to try to alienate a group of people entirely who spend a lot of money on their industry. And so this is fascinating to me. And here you have the teapot being sold. So you see down there at the bottom something called the Declaratory Act. See that? Declaratory or declaratory? So what's that? You guys read about that? How many of you guys, mom or dad, well, probably mom, but maybe dad, I don't know how your dads and moms are, but you've been really, really wanting something and they keep telling you, no, you just want that iPhone 11, or you really want that, I don't know, new car. And they're like, or you want to stay out past curfew. And they're like, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. And one day you get them when they're really tired and they're kind of exhausted, and they're like, okay, you can do that, but this is the last time, and I can still change it if I want to. Have you ever heard something like that? When I used to manage a grocery store, but even before that, I was like a bag boy. And one of the things I always remember is like 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Mom would have picked up her children from daycare or something, and they're winding through the store, and you can hear as the mom is winding her way, the baby or the kids screaming and getting louder and louder, and you can just imagine her fatigue. And she finally gets up to the checkout lane, and what's there? What's at the checkout lane?
Candy.
Yes. And little Johnny looks over, sees all that candy, and says, Mom, I want some candy. And, mom's exhausted and tired, and she's like, okay, here, but it's the last time, and all you kids would hear would be like, scream loudly. Okay. All right. So it's sort of a form of appeasement, right? Like, hey, we'll give in to you. So the Declaratory Act is they repealed the Stamp Act. All right. But then they said, we didn't repeal it because of you. We didn't repeal it because of your pressure. And we can still pass any laws that we want that binds the colonies. If you're the colonists, what do you smell here? What have you gotten?
That revolting is gonna get rid of the axe.
Yes. If I resist and resist well, we get what we want. So the takeaway here is there's really two ways they could have done it. Had Britain come in right then, arrested Sam Adams, crushed liberty, and established tyranny, then there probably would have not been a revolution the same way. All right, but because they're like, we're civilized people, we'll repeal this. Then the colonists are like, yes, they. But I want to flip that around. Do you think the colonists thought this was kind of the end of it then? Do you think that they said, well, we're going to have taxation without representation? Well, they didn't. It changed. All right. But before we go on to that, I do want to take on the topic again of, was it unfair? I tend to think that it was not unfair. So if you look here, the average English person, this is based on records that we have, documentation from the same period, the Stamp Act, paid about 312 pence, which is not like a penny, but it's where we get the word from. It would be like an equivalent of a relatively a decent amount of money every year. It wasn't crushing, but it was a lot for the English subject. Okay. In Massachusetts, they pay, Pennsylvania, New York, those Yankees, they pay 12 pence. You got how much in England? 312. And you have 12, which is 4% of what these people paid. And in Virginia, they paid 5 cents. Okay. So, the English government is saying, what on earth are y'all griping about? You're paying 5 cents on our 312, and you get all the benefits of being English people without having to pay for it, and they're like, yeah, I know, it works. All right. But that's kind of the attitude here. Sometimes I'm like, I don't really think that the taxes were that high. So when I say that, it means it was probably about what topic or issue? You guys watch Bob's Burgers? No Bob's Burgers fans in here? It's the principle of the thing. All right. Yeah. All right. Jaden, Yeah. All right. So if you've ever watched Bob, whenever he fights over something, it's because of the principle of the thing, right? So for them, it isn't the amount of taxes, it's the principle of being taxed without their permission. Okay. Well, we're going to stop with that today and move on to tomorrow. Here's one more little set of data. But tomorrow we'll pick up with after the Declaratory Act. By the way, this is the other reason why the Stamp Act is repealed. Tax was supposed to be bringing in 60,000 pounds a year, okay, which would have made up about 20% of the deficit that they needed. Their total amount was 3,200 pounds. So enforcement of the Stamp Act. Hey, by the way, I didn't even talk about this. I should talk about this before I let you go. Why were the Stamp Act so successfully protested to begin with? Why were people so angry about it? Forgot to talk about this. The Stamp Act, guys, was different than the Sugar Act and the Quartering Act because of who was most hit by it. So if you look at this list down here, and hopefully you do, lawyers, ministers, printers, and innkeepers. Lawyers, John Adams, Patrick Henry. Tavern guys, Sam Adams, right? Printers, Benjamin Franklin. These are the people who use paper, but these are also the influencers of 18th century America. What's the most respected profession in America? Ministry. Where do people hang out? Taverns. So if you're going to tick off a group of people in the colonies, this is absolutely the worst group to tick off because they have the voice to speak out against it. Raising a tax on pins for women would have been awful, but they didn't have a voice much. These are the people who have the definition of the social media of their day, right? They are the newspaper printers. They are the preachers. And a tax that had to be on every paper document. So every legal document, every will, every marriage license, every newspaper publication, this fell hardest on the people who had the loudest pulpit, the loudest source to be the loudest loudspeaker to be angry about it. And so obviously it's an easy tax to do because when you bought the paper, it had a stamp, on it, embossment. But this group's going to be like, no. And again, if you want to tick off a group, don't tick off the people who everyone else listens to, right? And so that's my conclusion there. So the next go round with the guy named Champagne Charlie Townsend is going to be a lot smarter for the British. They're going to be like, oh, we figured out how to tax these guys without their knowledge. And that's where I'll leave you guys today with that. Okay. So if you have any questions, now's a good time. We're going to